Let's turn now to bottom fermentation beers, or lagers by any other name. And the history of lager, we can trace it back a number of years, but probably most importantly, we go to the edict in Germany in 1553, which said that brewers were forbidden to brew between St. George's Day, which of course is April the 23rd, and Michaelmas, which is September the 29th. Some say that was to avoid the risk of fire, because in those days they would light a fire underneath the kettle, underneath the boiling stage. And of course, in the warmer summer months, the risk of fire was greater. Other people think it was because there was an increased risk of microorganisms spoiling the beer in the warmer summer months. But whatever the reason, this edict was introduced, and so you had to brew at a certain time of year and store the beer for the summer months before you could drink it. Lagering is to store. And the classic lager style originated in the mid-19th century brewhouse in Bohemia, which these days, of course, is the Western Czech Republic, in the Pilsen city brewhouse. This, of course, is Pilsner beer. They were very concerned back in Pilsen those days. The beer wasn't very good. So a guy went out and he searched the globe for the best of technology. To find out how to make great pale malts, he went to England. In terms of yeast, well, he spirited that away from Germany with a few brewers as well, for good measure. And thus they came up with a very golden, lightly colored lager beer. Alcohol content classically is in the region of 4.8 to 5.1% ABV, this pale gold color, and particularly prized for the late hop character. If you recall, this is where you add hops late in the boiling stage so that you hold some of the oil back in there to give an aroma. As I said, after cooling, you ferment, the yeast transforms that character, and you get this very subtle late hop character, the classic Pilsner beer. It's very interesting, if you go to the Czech Republic, this beer can often have a slight butterscotch or popcorn character. Now, across the world of brewing, this character, which is due to a substance called diacetyl, is frowned upon. It's generally considered not to be desirable in beer, but it's desired in the Czech Pilsner style beer. So it just goes to show that what is right for one company or classic beer style is not necessarily what other people want. Different beers, different people. Now, all too often, people use the word lager synonymously with Pilsner. So they see a pale colored beer and they call it a Pilsner, even though technically speaking, it is not a Pilsner. And some people believe or seem to think that beer or lager starts and ends with Pilsner, and nothing could be further from the truth. Thus we have Bock beers. A friend of mine, perhaps with tongue-in-cheek, says this was a beer designed by the monks to get them through Lent. So a strong beer. They were, they had to give up other things for Lent, but they weren't going to give up the beer. And it was nutritious, but fairly alcoholic. So Bocks tend to be relatively stronger in alcohol. They may be 6-8% ABV. If you look at a Bock, often on the label, there's a goat. That is a symbol of strength, a billy goat, symbol of strength. Not always the goat, but it's a piece of history there. The Bock beers tend to be relatively malty, quite sulfury in their flavor. We'll talk about sulfury types of flavors in a later lecture. Quite malty then, but they can be of a range of colors. Some of them may be fairly gently colored, straw colored, but some of them could be darker and with a more brownish coloration, depending on the malt that is used. Now, if you've got a Doppelbock or a Dubbelbock, a double bock, then of course they are substantially more alcoholic, very warming. And they may be as high as 12% alcohol by volume, Doppelbock. Then there are Maibocks, or Maybocks, which are for the spring. And these will often have a more golden, refreshing sort of appearance. The alcohol content is going to be in the region of about 6.8, 7% alcohol by volume. A word now about drinking temperature. Okay? And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a later lecture. But a Maibock, the classic temperature for drinking a Maibock is 9 degrees Celsius. I ought to convert that into Fahrenheit, didn't I, for you? But 9 degrees Celsius. Whereas a refrigerated temperature is about 4 degrees Celsius. So these are not drunk warm. We talked about warm in a different context earlier on, but they're certainly not icy cold as well. Then there are Winterbocks. These are often somewhat darker in appearance, similar sort of alcohol content, and they'll contain more of the darker malts in the grist. So that's Winterbock. Let's now go to the Mills River Brewery of Sierra Nevada Brewing Company to talk about Märzen and some other lager-style beers. Here we are back at Mills River, and I want to talk about Märzen, March beer. In the history lecture, we talked about how the German brewers were forbidden to brew in the summer months. So they brewed right the way through to March, and then couldn't be brewing after that. So they wanted a beer that was going to be able to be stored through the summer months, progressively consumed, and then finished off around the time that they could start brewing again in September. So this is Märzen. And to allow it to have a pretty good shelf life, it was brewed to a relatively high alcohol content, around 6.5% ABV. And there were pale and there are dark versions. Sometimes people refer to the dark versions as Vienna lagers because they're made with a malt which is called Vienna malt. It's a fairly heavily heated malt, still got the enzymes in there, but heated sufficiently strongly to get a bit of color and some interesting, stronger flavors. Related to this is a beer style called Oktoberfest. And the history of the Oktoberfest stems back to a marriage celebration for Crown Prince Ludwig of Bavaria and Princess Theresa of Saxony-Hildburghausen, just outside the Munich city gates. And they decided to throw a party. This party lasted from October the 12th to October the 17th. A jubilant party full of food, beer, parades, music. And it was so successful they decided to have it every year. And it grew in popularity and became so popular in Munich that the city leaders pushed the starting date back to the middle of September because the weather was a bit better. The days were longer and they could really party nicely. So these days, Oktoberfest begins the third weekend in September and ends the first Sunday in October. And the last count, about 7.5 million litres of beer consumed over 16 days. That's a significant party. The name Oktoberfest beer is restricted strictly to those 6 breweries that are permitted to sell their products at the festival in Munich. And by name, they are Paulaner, Augustiner, Löwenbräu, Hacker Schor, Spaten, and Hofbrauhaus. But Oktoberfest beer styles are brewed all over the world, including here at Sierra Nevada. And their Oktoberfest beer is a partnership with the Bitburger Brewing Company from Germany. So Sierra Nevada have got a history of interacting with other brewing companies, including this one. And so the Bitburger yeast is used to brew this particular beer. Oktoberfest beer, not especially bitter, but a good alcohol kick, and much more about the malt than it is about the hops. So let's now turn to another German beer style, and that is Keller beer. Let's turn now to Keller beer, cellar beer. This is generally unfiltered, a regular beer that you would have in the beer cellar in Germany. And related to that is Helles. Helles. The word hell in Germany means pale. So Helles is a relatively lightly colored lager style beer. It's going to have an alcohol content somewhere between 4.5% to 5% or 5.5% alcohol by volume. This is very malty. This is not about hops. This is about malt, so it tends to be relatively low in bitterness and low in hop aroma. Helles, that is the almost, I like to call it the workhorse lager beer in Germany. Dunkels are like Helles, but much darker. They're a copper brown color. Of course, as we've established, that is because of the use of more specialty malts in the caramel crystal malt region. Then we have Schwarzbier, black beer. Now, most people would think lager, black, really? Well, of course, Schwarzbier is black beer. And what they do is they include in the grist some heavily roasted grain. Now, they've probably, before roasting, taken the outer layers off that grain, the husk, because if you burn that, you roast that, you really do get a lot of strong astringency. So they're drying dehusked grain to get a very intense dark color and some degree of roasted character as well. Very dry beer, maybe as low as 3.8% alcohol by volume or up to 5%, but black lager. It's a lager because it is produced with bottom fermenting yeast, Saccharomyces pastorianus. Now, when we talked about ales, I mentioned Kirsch. Kirsch is the hybrid beer that I talked about with an ale yeast operating under lager, fermentation, and maturation conditions. The opposite of that is a beer that is called California Common. The brand you've likely heard of is Anchor Steam Beer. Now, Fritz Maytag, who really revitalized the Anchor Brewing Company, he protected the term steam beer. So the only person who can use, or the only company that can use the term steam beer in the United States of America is the Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco. Everybody else, they have to call this beer style California Common. This is a lager yeast operating under ale fermentation conditions. Now, people argue about the origin of the term steam. Some people say, well, it was the steam that was coming off the wort as it was cooling down before putting the yeast in there. This was back in the gold rush days in the mid-19th century. Other people say, well, it's this vigor with which the yeast is working in the fermentation at these higher temperatures. It doesn't really matter. It's a brand, it's a concept, and it's a hybrid style. A lager yeast operating under ale fermentation conditions, warmer fermentation conditions. If we pop back over to Germany, then we come to Rauchbier. Rauchbier. Now, Rauchbier, particularly well loved in Bamberg, is made with smoked malt. We talked about the malting process, steeping, germination, kilning. Well, when you are drying the malts to make Rauchbier, you incorporate burning beechwood. Now, you've likely heard of beechwood aging in the context of famous North American lager beer, where the beer is aged over wood as an exercise in cleaning up the flavor. But if you burn the beechwood, you produce this smoky character which suffuses the malt, and then if you make a beer using that malt, then it's going to have a pronounced smoky flavor. I liken it to smoky bacon. If you've ever had anything that's smoked bacon, then you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a very strong flavor. And if you buy a Rauchbier, then you can get Bock's, you can get Märzens, but they share this characteristic of this strong burnt beechwood character. about 4.8% alcohol by volume. Wonderful for pairing with various types of cheeses, and if you are barbecuing meat, these things go very well indeed. And now let's turn to malt liquor. Malt liquor. And I have to talk about it somewhere. We best talk about it under the bottom fermentation beers. Malt liquor is really defined by the alcohol concentration. And it varies from place to place, state to state, about exactly what a malt liquor is. I well remember a famous Thai beer, Singa beer, in California, and at the time it was 6.2% alcohol by volume. It had to be labeled malt liquor at that alcohol concentration. They actually changed the formulation, made it 5% alcohol by volume. Now it's a Pilsner's type beer. So it's a semantic thing based on the alcohol concentration. But many of the malt liquors are made with grists that are relatively lower in malt, quite high amounts of adjuncts, including sugars, very lightly hopped, fairly sweet, but again, with quite a kick to them. The question is, when does an ale become a lager? We've talked about hybrids, we talked about Kolsch, we talked about California Common, Anchor Steam beer. I've been to lots of breweries over the years, and I've toured around, and they've very proudly shown me we've gone into the bar first, and they showed me a selection of their beers, ales, lagers, and then I've gone around the brewery with the brewmaster, and I've toured around, and I've said, how many yeasts do you have in this brewery? And they've said, oh, just the one. So they're actually making ales, and they're making products they call lagers, but they've only got one yeast. So technically speaking, if they've got an ale yeast, they're not making lager, they're making Kolsch. Does it matter, is the question. Now, if you are passionate, and it's got to be absolutely right, then of course it matters. But can you make products that are, by all appearances, lager beers, but can you make them with ale yeast? Then technically no, because if it's made with an ale yeast, it's an ale. But can you make a product which is indistinguishable from a different type of lager beer? Yes, you can. So it really is up to the logistics. It's easier in a brewery just to have one yeast strain rather than have lots and lots of different yeast strains for different products. So logistically, it might be easier, but it depends on how you feel in your heart as the brewer, whether you want to genuinely produce a lager style beer. So that is lagers.